Okay, so I have a degree in law. I've been doing this work for 14 years as of January next year. Most of that has been frontlines doing DV and family law work, although I have eased back and started doing a little more in the way of commercial work and advising charities and schools about the various things that they have to deal with. My experience started really frontlines doing DV work, and in fact I can tell you my first day as a lawyer was spent drafting a trial affidavit for a victim of domestic violence. And after that day, I went home to my husband and said, I never thought I'd hear any of the stories that I've just heard. These days, not very much shocks me, and Eustacia pretty much is the same. I've got more university degrees, I suspect, but Eustacia has also got a graduate diploma in divinity, having looked very closely, I think, at Christian theology, and I have really found her background in that helpful for today. At the moment, Eustacia heads up the family law team here. So the plan today, usually lawyers have got a whole lot of exclusions. Here's the ones for today. I'm just a lawyer. I'm not a pastor. I have no theological training. Today is really about giving you some information and possibly posing quite a lot of questions for you to think about and work through with your team. Hopefully today will be a series of discussions that you have with your team about how to improve your ministry to people who have experienced domestic violence or are experiencing family and domestic violence. I would hope that you also get some clues about how to deal with people who perpetrate domestic violence, because at the end of the day, we have an epidemic on our hands in Australia, and unless we focus on both, we're probably not going to make that much of a difference. So the usual caveats, I will be actually talking about some real life cases today. All names, locations and denominations have been changed to protect the innocent. And all of the things I talk about will be based on real life scenarios that have actually happened. I've practiced both outside of Brisbane and also in Brisbane, and so some of that will draw on some historical stuff and some of it will be more recent. So a couple of scenarios. A member of your congregation discloses that they're the victim of domestic violence during ongoing counselling. This was an interesting one in that this particular church took the view that if they spoke to the other party and they repented, that it would be all okay. It wasn't. The second one was a real life situation that I dealt with that I must say really opened my eyes to the dangers of pastors not understanding something about domestic violence. In this particular matter, the husband had been charged and convicted of raping one of the children. There'd been a long history of domestic violence. There were court orders in place, domestic violence orders in place that said that he couldn't have any contact directly or indirectly with my client, the wife, or his children. And he'd gone to jail and he'd apparently been saved in jail. There wasn't a lot of detail about that, so no one was quite sure, but he informed everyone who would listen that God had told him that that he was going to reconcile with his wife and that he needed to take steps along those lines. I'm not sure how much information the pastor had, but he went to the pastor and he enlisted the pastor's assistance to make contact with my client to open a dialogue about reconciling. The domestic violence in that matter was some of the worst I'd ever seen, to be honest, and I was quite unhappy when I found that the pastor had left 2 phone messages for my client. Both had spun my client out. My client was in tears and barely coping. And one of them specifically referenced the fact that the pastor knew that the husband couldn't make contact directly, and that's why he was doing so. Now, I'm sure that that pastor was acting with the best of intentions. What it did, though, was cause a lot of grief for the victim of domestic violence. And unbeknownst, I suspect, to the pastor, it assisted the husband to breach a existing domestic violence order, and it arguably aided and abetted in the breach of a domestic violence order. That could have gotten a whole range of people in trouble had it been reported, but in the end, our client did not feel strong enough to go through that process. The third example is an example that, again, shocked me really in the way it was dealt with. My client was the wife. She spoke to her pastor about the fact that she was separating from her spouse who had been physically violent, and she disclosed that she had been to see myself and that she had made an application for a domestic violence order, and the domestic violence order had been granted. The pastor decided that the appropriate course of action was to try to get my client and the husband together in joint counselling sessions. Never a great idea for a variety of reasons, but they did. And the husband made all the right noises and said he was very sorry and wouldn't do it again. And the pastor told my client that she was obliged to do everything she could to save her marriage, because that's what the Bible says. In the end, she informed me that she wanted me to withdraw her domestic violence order, and we did. We withdrew the application and we sought that the existing temporary order be vacated, because he promised he would never do it again. In the course of them working through their issues, they lived separately for a period. And I was not surprised, but I was very distressed to find out that my client came back to me about 6 weeks later, because he had located which church she had been going to in the meantime, and had followed her home from church while she was walking home, and had actually veered onto the wrong side of the road, crossed the curb, and tried to run her over as she walked home from church. Suffice to say, that was the trigger for yet another domestic violence application, and one that she stayed the course with, possibly to the distress of the pastor, I suspect, but nevertheless, safety arrangements were made, and to my knowledge, she didn't return to an unsafe situation. The other one, the last one in terms of interacting with someone in the church family, was a situation that I came across where a couple that I knew reasonably well, something just seemed off. And it turned out that there were some significant issues with control that were not recognised for what they were, which was basically non-physical violence, but a domestic violence situation. Things came to a head one night when she turned up to my house at about 9:15 in tears, having nowhere else to go. So in the big scheme of things, everyone else thought it was all okay, but everyone was sitting there thinking, I'm not sure whether this is, what the go is with this. It seems a bit unusual, but no one had picked it for domestic violence at that point. So I want to talk a little bit about the word pictures we use. We Christians use some words and phrases that people don't necessarily understand all of the time. We use pictures and stories to illustrate the nature of God and to illustrate the nature of relationships. And that's really as it should be. Jesus used, as you would know, lots of stories. And the narrative approach is what really resonates with people. I think we're built and designed for stories. But communication is not just what we tell someone, it's a process. Good communication is about sending a message that we hope will be received in the way that we intended it to be received. It's only where they receive the same message that we're trying to communicate that good communication occurs. The experiences that people have in their family of origin and their lived experience will impact heavily upon their perceptions. When we use word pictures like, Jesus the bridegroom and his care to the church, how does that actually look to someone who's grown up into a relationship where the husband is in fact quite violent? It becomes a really tricky situation. I have two examples that really shed some light on, I suppose, some concerns about how we, in fact, talk. The first is that there was a young man who was speaking to a colleague of mine who was before the courts in relation to criminal matters. He was in relation to, he was there for matters that were relatively minor, and the duty lawyer said, no problem, I don't expect you to serve any time. That particular young man begged the duty lawyer to do her absolute worst, or alternatively, not to help him at all and he'd self-represent. He wanted to go to jail, and the reason he wanted to go to jail was because his stepfather beat him most nights, and he was sleeping in a drain out the back of the house because it was safer to sleep in the drain than it was to sleep in the house. That young man ultimately wanted to go to juvenile detention because it was safer than going home to his stepdad. And I might add, his stepdad was the only dad he'd ever known. The second one is an interesting one. It's a young lady who I know very well. She is now actively involved in protecting women and children in this space. But as a 7-year-old, she grew up watching her dad beat her mum up. And the relationship continued until such time as he turned on her as a 7-year-old and he physically harmed her. Her mum at that point decided that enough was enough. But have a think about how those two people react to the phrase, God loves us like a dad. Because the dads that they knew are nothing like we would hope that the word picture we're sending actually conveys. What do you talk about? What are you saying to someone who's been the victim of domestic violence when you're talking to them about Jesus the bridegroom and how much he loves and cares for his church? Because the message that they're receiving and the message you're hoping to send are very different. When people get to the end of a relationship, there's a grieving cycle, and the older research tended to suggest that it was just like when someone died. You know, they went through the same steps. The difficulty is that the more recent research says that it's actually a cycle, and it continues indefinitely. So, you know, the denial and all of those things in that cycle, it's not linear. The difficulty comes when two people who are grieving the end of a relationship are in totally different parts of that cycle. That causes even more conflict than there already is. But when a relationship comes to an end, a number of very practical things have to be dealt with. People need to be able to find out where they're going to live. They need to know how they're going to finance basic things like food and electricity and phone bills. They need to know that they've got somewhere safe to be. And the short version is that there are a lot of people in this world who rightly and wrongly think that we lawyers are the devil incarnate and we should not be involved. The short version is timely early advice can really make a difference in terms of getting good outcomes and getting good outcomes for people at an early stage that mean that it's low conflict and the matter doesn't have to go to court. The other thing is it's really important to be making referrals that are appropriate and useful. Self-evidently, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, often people have mental health issues. Sometimes they have medical issues, sometimes they have psychological issues, sometimes they have very practical problems. And it's important to deal with those matters as well as caring for the person. When a domestic violence relationship ends and separations occur, you need to remember that a victim of domestic violence will generally leave and reconcile a number of times or attempt to leave and reconcile a number of times. The average number of times is 9. Now, I can tell you that sitting by and watching your friend go back into a DV relationship is really hard work. I've done a lot of really difficult things over the years, and I can still say to you that quite apart from the very dangerous things that I've done at times, the hardest night of my life was sitting there with my girlfriend, icing the bruises on her legs and making her a cup of tea and crying with her, knowing that I had to just wait until she was ready to leave. Understand that when someone decides to leave a domestic violence relationship, the most dangerous time for them is at the time they leave, so within a very short period of leaving, and 12 months after they separate. Those 2 times are, statistically speaking, the most lethal. That's when most people die. Safety is incredibly important. Please do not underestimate how much danger a woman can be in when they're leaving a DV situation. There may well be a bunch of legal issues that need to be dealt with in terms of debts and repayments of joint loans, child support, parenting arrangements, property, spousal maintenance, domestic violence, child protection. There's a bunch of things that need to happen. It's really important when those sorts of things arise that people are referred early, because if you get in place a strategy to deal with those things, it can be a lot smoother than if you're dealing with things reactionarily, in a reactionary way. I'm just going to hand over to you, Stacia, to go through some of the legal stuff for a bit and give my voice a rest.
Thanks, Fiona. It is a privilege and a pleasure to be bringing this webinar to you today. I'm pleased to be able to speak to this slide because I think it's really important that people understand, I guess, what domestic violence really is. This is not a definition that is made up by soft-minded or soft-hearted social workers or people in counselling positions. This is actually the law of the land about what domestic violence is, and it's more than just physical or sexual abuse. Obviously, that's the clearest example and probably the one that is most well understood, but it is simply not the entirety of the definition. I think it's really important to realise that it is a complex and difficult thing to understand because there are lots of different ways that people conduct their relationships and personalities and that sort of thing, but there are lines in the sand, and I think probably the easiest way to understand it is to say, is that behaviour or are those words or is that conduct designed to control or dominate the other person? Is it to create a sense of fear for their personal safety and well-being, or the safety and well-being of someone close to them? And anything that arises out of a motive like that will fall within these categories. So obviously physical and sexual abuse is easily identifiable as domestic violence. Emotional or psychological abuse. Now, this one, I'm just going to, probably the easiest way to talk about these things is just to give some examples. So emotional or psychological abuse often takes the form of insults. So it's verbal. You're so unattractive. You're so overly sensitive to everything. You do nothing to make yourself attractive to me. You're so boring in bed. These are all comments that I've heard from clients who I would characterise as a form of psychological abuse because it speaks to their character and it's beyond just recognising that maybe they've got skills in cooking or haven't. It speaks to who they are as a person. Economic abuse, this can take lots of different forms and oftentimes it's hard to, recognise. There may be very good practical or tax reasons why property might be in one person's name and not the other. But again, if it's about controlling or dominating, and the subtle ways that plays out is it's often couched in terms of, well, I know better about what this family needs, or I just want to protect you, or something along those lines. There's usually, we can point to examples where usually the wife is given a meagre amount to live on, and she's expected to provide for the family out of that and account for it, whereas the husband who earns the money is not required to account to her at all for his spending. Oftentimes there will be pressure to combine bank accounts rather than keep separate accounts. Often the spending of the victim of domestic violence is heavily scrutinised, and she's often asked to justify the expenditure in much the same way that you might scrutinise the spending of a small child. Threatening or coercive behaviour can obviously take many kinds of forms, including from nasty looks across the table to quite passive-aggressive behaviours, which tend to be fairly unique to the personalities and cultural baggage that come. So what might be considered threatening in one situation or between one couple is not perhaps considered threatening in another. And again, this is part of the difficulty in defining it. Yes, threatening or coercive behaviour often will take the form of threats to expose a person's vulnerabilities. So I will tell the pastor that you said this or did that, or I'll tell your mother, or I'll tell the children, or I'll tell your boss, is also not an uncommon one. And so particularly, I guess, in the church context, if someone is coming to reveal something to you about what their partner has said, there's probably a measure of thinking that through that needs to occur about whether that in fact is acting out on a threat or is designed to be coercive in order to get the other party to comply with something that they want. Threatening suicide or self-harm, that's fairly self-explanatory, I think. It happens a lot more frequently than you might imagine. And then other behaviour that is controlling or dominating, and clearly this can take all kinds of forms. I was just thinking through some other examples that I've heard, everything from I have made my $300 a week, feed the children, pay this bill, have, spent it on legitimate expenses, but now I don't have enough money to have my script made up for my antidepressant medication. And then the husband says, well, if I give you that money, how will you ever learn to manage money properly? I've heard that one a couple of times. Again, we often hear that, oh yes, perpetrators of domestic violence will isolate their victims, and I don't know, I think we tend to think of that as a fairly, in fairly extreme ways, like compelling them to move cities to somewhere remote or to encourage them to cut off certain friendships. But it also happens a lot more subtly as well. For example, in terms of breaking them down and isolating them from the simple experiences of life that will lead them to independence, they will, for example, if a wife is studying for a degree or a course of study of some kind, for some reason there always seems to be a major fight the night before an exam or the day of the exam. And so it becomes just too hard, I guess, for her to continue that course of study. So it's just a very subtle but deliberate way of cutting off the options that she will have to become that independent person. So they're just a few examples, and I'll hand back to Fiona now.
Thanks, Insertion. So I want to talk a little bit about why it matters. It was White Ribbon Day last week, and I sent an email to our crew setting out some of this material, and I think it's useful to share. In my view, I think the things to remember is that domestic violence damages our community. It absolutely debilitates debilitating to victims and witnesses of domestic violence. It can be deadly to its victims, and it's utterly devastating in terms of its impact upon our children. It has some pretty wide-reaching implications and effects. In Australia, research that was done by the National Centre for Domestic and Family Violence Research in Mackay found that if a woman had been subjected to physical abuse at any point in their relationship, in their current relationship, they were 7 times more likely than the state average to have a severe psychological issue. If that abuse was in the last 12 months, they were 21 times the state average more likely to have a severe psychological issue. If there had been sexual abuse at all within the relationship, it was 17 times more likely that they would have a severe psychological issue. There are massive effects on physical health, on people's ability to hold down a job, and on their spiritual health. Financially, PricewaterhouseCoopers have recently prepared a report that estimated the annual cost of violence against women in Australia costs us $21.7 billion per year. On the current trajectory, they're expecting over the next 30 years, if nothing changes, that that's going to cost the Australian community $323.4 billion. I'm fairly confident that I could find better things to do with $323 billion. Those costs include health costs, including physical violence, long-term costs of treating depression, anxiety, PTSD, lost productivity at work through absenteeism, being late, having to attend court, or just not being present. It includes consumption costs in terms of DV victims having to replace items which are damaged during DV incidents, refurnishing houses when they choose to leave, and medical costs associated with caring for children who witness DV. The costs to the community in terms of caring for children who are taken into the care of the department, for example, where it's not safe for them to live at home, are significant. There can be any number of interventions required, and the costs of running those sorts of interventions are huge. There are significant costs to the legal and criminal system for running courts and police services and prisons. None of them are cheap. If you happen to think about the fact that that young man we talked about earlier was desperate to go to prison, that was a direct cost that would have cost the community, but it was safer for him to go to prison than it was to stay home. No one really thinks about it, but funerals are not terribly cheap. I'm pretty sure you all know that. But there were far too many in Australia in the last 5 years that are directly related to domestic violence. Too many in Australia in the last 5 years that are directly related to domestic violence. There are additional school services that are incurred and security upgrades for houses and businesses that are required. And there's a whole lot of hidden costs that people don't really think about. But it's damaging to our community as a whole. In terms of how debilitating, Vic Health research has found that domestic violence is the leading contributor to death, disability and illness in Victorian women between the ages of 15 and 44. That's more than people who have issues with high blood pressure, smoking and obesity. Quite apart from physical injuries and chronic pain and mental health, domestic violence has been linked to significant levels of acquired brain injuries in Australia. Nearly 18% of all depression experienced by women is directly related to domestic violence. My suspicion is it's actually probably higher than that, and I base that on the fact that, statistically speaking, domestic violence is chronically underreported. So we generally assume that we see probably less than half of what's actually happening in terms of domestic violence, both in terms of the severity but also in terms of the number of people who report. In terms of how deadly, 2014 we had 95 DV-related deaths in Australia. 2015 we had 158, 2016 176, 2017, and this one the data's a bit tricky because they've changed the way it's presented this year, but I think from my my reading of it, we're talking about 201 DV-related deaths in Australia last year. So far this year, we've had 57 women die as a confirmed victim of DV homicides. And that doesn't include the children, because unfortunately in these situations, what we often see is a familicide approach, where the woman is harmed or killed, the children are killed, and then the perpetrator turns the rifle or whatever their weapon of choice is upon themselves. Last year, a third of all sexual assaults that were reported to police were DV related. And in terms of the interesting statistics, if you really drill down and have a look at it, a lot of people have said to me, oh, well, it's all about guns. It's actually not. A third of all DV-related homicides were done with their bare hands. That's pretty compelling in terms of, if you think about what that actually means, that means hand-to-hand, someone tried to kill someone and succeeded. Of the 2/3 of homicides that did involve a weapon, most commonly that was a knife. So something like, I think it was about 60% of matters involved a knife. In terms of the homicides that involved a weapon, it usually sits at around about 7% involved an actual rifle or gun of some description. So, and that doesn't seem to be changing very much. But consistently, you're most likely looking at a knife or bare hands. In terms of our kids, the recent research is suggesting that kids that are exposed to or witness domestic violence have the same structural changes in their brain as kids who've grown up in a war zone. That's frightening. Chronic and toxic stress in children causes significant problems with their brain formation in terms of growth and the way that the brain actually fires and communicates. And that's more likely to cause all sorts of problems later on in terms of the ability of that person to maintain appropriate relationships and to be able to communicate with other people. We look at the significant communication problems we have with all sorts of adults in our community. That's not really surprising, because we've had a lot of people growing up in DV relationships who think that that's normal. I'm intrigued by the number of people who say to me, oh, well, that's okay, because the child at the time was only a baby and they wouldn't have known. Babies and young infants that are exposed to abuse and neglect are much more likely to experience insecure or disorganised attachment problems, and they alter the normal way that a developmental process for a child progresses. It severely impacts upon a child's ability to communicate and interact with others and form healthy relationships. The quote I want to particularly remind you of is one that I've seen a few times, but it's well researched, and it says, research over the past 20 years has unequivocally determined that children who are exposed to violence in the home suffer a wide range of poor psychosocial and health outcomes. The literature indicates that exposure to domestic and family violence in childhood is clearly associated with depression, anxiety, trauma symptoms, aggression, lower social competence, low self-esteem, fear and loneliness. Children exposed to domestic and family violence in childhood also have generally poorer academic outcomes, higher rates of peer conflict and impaired cognitive function. Health and socioeconomic impacts include higher likelihood of future alcohol and drug abuse, depression, unemployment and homelessness. And what we tend to see is that where kids have been exposed to domestic violence, we're seeing them present with a cluster of problems. Often they're either the bullies in the playground or they are the victims of bullies in the playground. They have issues with their schooling. They have issues with their ability to have interpersonal relationships. They have issues in terms of, particularly when they get older, maintaining healthy boundaries and relationships with members of the opposite sex. One of the frightening statistics I've come across recently in my work with a variety of people about how to approach child-on-child sexual assault matters is that in one of the more recent and fairly credible studies that ended up before the Royal Commission, 95% of the children surveyed who had engaged in sexual assault of another child had also experienced or witnessed a domestic violence incident and had some trauma as a result. So we're seeing that it's flowing over into a variety of other areas, and our kids are suffering. So we've talked a little bit about talking about Jesus the bridegroom with a victim of DV, and talking about God the Father with a child who's been beaten by their dad. I want you to have a think about how we actually expect them to understand what we're trying to communicate and what we can do better about that. DV matters in ministry because we're called to bind up the broken. We're called to liberate the captives and care for the widows. In Ezekiel 34, there's a scathing judgment on the shepherds of Israel who were eating the fat and clothing themselves with the wool of the flock, that they failed to strengthen the diseased, heal the sick, bind up the broken, and seek the lost. Instead, Jesus models that course of action himself, and we should be seeking as far as possible to do what Jesus did. Isaiah 61, the writer says that the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound. I want to say to you very clearly that people who have experienced domestic violence, even if it's not physical violence, are broken. Even if it looks on the surface like they're doing okay, the chances are that they're actually not. And there's no one really who is more captive than someone who's stuck in a DV relationship with zero hope of actually leaving that relationship. The one place that's supposed to be safe for them at home, the relationship that's supposed to be supportive, has actually become a prison. The number of people who sit in our offices and say to us, I wish people understood that I just couldn't leave. I didn't have that option. I wish you could hear the stories when people are telling us how they've been held captive.
If I could just interject there and say that is also the experience of people who are suffering domestic violence, but it is not necessarily physical or sexual violence. I don't have a statistic to hand, but I am aware that the research does indicate that the fallout from non-violent domestic violence, if you like, non-physical, I should say, can be just as damaging as someone who has experienced physical violence. So just because, he hasn't hit me, doesn't mean that they won't experience the same psychological trauma.
Domestic violence is one of Australia's leading criminal health and wellbeing issues at the moment. You will have seen a lot in the news about it, I'm sure. I was intrigued to see this week that Magistrate Baldwin, who is a former family lawyer from Gympie, sentenced a gentleman, and I use that phrase fairly loosely, who had engaged in some significant domestic violence against his wife on the basis that her family had not yet paid him the dowry that he was entitled to. And so there was some cultural overtime, but Magistrate Baldwin said, and it was reported in the ABC, you're welcome to go and have a look, she told the man that he would have had to have been living under a rock not to know that Australia was very serious about dealing with domestic violence. And so we are. It is a significant issue in our community. Most people in your congregation will experience it, be exposed to it, or know someone who's going through it. Sometimes they recognise it for what it is, sometimes they don't. But Jesus specifically calls us to bind up the broken and liberate the captives. And church leaders are uniquely positioned to respond helpfully in these situations, because it doesn't just require a legal response, it requires emotional support and friend support and very practical support in some cases. The number of people who choose to stay in a domestic violence relationship because they can go to refuge, but there's no option for who's going to care for their dog and cat in the meantime, is astonishing. And you would be surprised, a lot of people have endured, for example, threats to harm the pet, the family pet. And a lot of people say, well, I can't take the pet with me to refuge, so I won't go at all. Those are very practical things that churches can absolutely be involved in. Churches are also, unfortunately, uniquely positioned to do significant harm if they don't deal with it or if they deal with it poorly. Sin, and in this case abuse, thrives where there are conditions of silence. God was frequently condemning of oppression and burdening people by abuse of power or position and the use of violence. In comparison, Jesus manifests humility and gentleness and self-sacrificing and care for others. It's proper and appropriate for us in churches to be embracing justice and mercy and to consider our responsibilities not only to live under the laws of the land and encouraging other people to do so, but also to be caring for others and doing the hard yards in terms of caring for the broken and making sure that people have options and are not captive. In terms of the DV cycle, this is something that I really wish family lawyers could tell churches more often. This is a fairly well-known cycle. It's a cycle which involves a blow-up or an explosion. Often that's physical, but not always. Often and usually the perpetrator is very remorseful. They're sorry, they'll never do it again. There's flowers, there's chocolates, there's all of the loving honeymoony stuff that you would expect. And there's a pursuit phase where they go, you know, I still love you and I want this and I'm going to make this work and I promise I'm never going to do it again.
I'll go to counselling.
Yeah, I'll go to counselling. We'll meet weekly with our pastor. There's all sorts of promises made in that pursuit and honeymoon phase, and sometimes it's good for a while, and then things start getting tense and there's a build-up, and it's like walking on eggshells around the house, and then there's a standover phase before an explosion. The difficulty is that there's a couple of issues with that. The shorter the cycle, in terms of time frame, generally speaking, the more dangerous it is. So once you get into a cycle that's less than a week between those phases, you can basically be reassured that it's going to be pretty nasty. The other thing is that the cycle tends to get shorter each time. So, for example, it might be 6 months between blow-ups for the first few, but then it's, you know, a couple of months, and then it's every month, and then it's every fortnight, and then it's every week. And over a period of years, it becomes increasingly more dangerous. The other problem, of course, is that for Christians, we expect that people are going to be remorseful and they're going to repent of their sin and they're going to turn their back on it and be forgiven for that. The difficulty is, how do you deal with the fact that genuine remorse and repentance often looks a lot like the remorse phase in the DV cycle? Because the difficulties are that often they say the right things when the perpetrators come into these sorts of scenarios. The one that I told you earlier about him trying to run her over, the pastor was, and I have no doubt, the pastor was genuinely of the view that this particular gentleman was genuinely remorseful and that he had repented of his actions and he was not a threat to her anymore. The difficulty is, I have to tell you, it's one of these ones where I'm personally of the view that churches should err on the side of it's probably part of the cycle rather than it's probably remorse and repentance.
I would agree with that.
For a long time, because this is so common. It's common to almost every domestic violence situation I've ever seen. And it's actually not easy to pick what's genuine and what's not. This question drives me a little bit mental at times. A lot of people in the community say, well, if it's so bad, why don't they leave? They don't leave for a lot of reasons. A lot of times they have zero self-control, self-esteem. They've been told for many years at times that they're hopeless, that they are incapable of caring for themselves, that they would never last outside the protection of the perpetrator. They tell them that I'm a fine, upstanding member of the church and no one will believe you that I've done these things. They'll all believe me. They feel embarrassed and ashamed that they're experiencing violence. In a church context, it's not uncommon for people to feel embarrassed or ashamed that they are leaving a relationship, where, of course, marriage is something that's taken very seriously by churches and by God. They generally don't have a lot of confidence left and they don't trust a lot of people because the people that they should have been able to trust, their family, their husbands, have broken their trust time and time and time again. So the fact that they don't trust people makes it difficult for them to access help. But everyone gets very upset about that at the same time. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, really. They may have had poor responses if they've spoken to someone previously. They might fear that the offender is going to minimise the incident to police and others. And in fact, they do regularly. Sometimes they're fearful of increased abuse, violence and physical restrictions, and that is rightly so. Remember at the beginning I said to you that the most dangerous time for a woman is when she leaves a domestically violent relationship, and 12 months later, around about the time they start thinking about divorce. That is not an insignificant fear, and it's not without basis. They're often fearful of not having financial security or somewhere to live. They're afraid of being alone or isolated or exposing the family to shame. Fearful of how the church family react is a really big one in churches. And a number of times I've sat with clients and I've said, what's really going on for you? Where are you at? And they've said to me, my church, my pastor, the elders have said that I should stay because the Bible says we should stay together. And sometimes they don't leave because they believe that the person is sitting there going, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again, and they believe them. The other fear is that if they do separate, the risk and the cost will be even higher. This is one where, personally, a girlfriend of mine, who's an incredibly intelligent and articulate lady, I said to her, what's holding you back at this point? And she said to me, if I leave, he will have unsupervised time with the kids and I will not be able to protect them.
That's not an uncommon.
Yep, it's a very regular concern. And to be fair, from a family law perspective, the system is pretty broken, and it's entirely possible that they will be right about that. The other thing to say is that, people who choose to leave a domestically violent relationship, there's a cost that attaches to that. Rosie Batty has been fairly prominent in the media in the last week or so. The story of Anne O'Neill has come forward, and she runs a charity that basically deals with or offers support to people who have really experienced untold horror. In her case, the husband came and killed the children in front of her and shot her. That resulted in her having her leg amputated, and I think he then, my recollection is he then turned the gun on himself. It's not an insignificant fear in terms of that things will get worse, because it quite possibly will. I've given you a list of referral options there. You'll be able to access this, so I would probably suggest that you keep this handy. I won't go through all of it at this point in time, but please be referring to people early in terms of if there's a lawyer that they trust, by all means send them to a lawyer. But they do need to go and get some legal advice sooner rather than later. So in terms of roles and responsibilities, these are the sorts of entities that might be involved. So Department of Communities, they've changed their name again, and I should have updated that, and I didn't. I think it's Child Safety, Youth and Women now, but in Queensland, but the local Department of Child Safety basically in your state. Their role is to protect children. They'll often be involved in partnership with the police, and they will intervene and remove children if there is not a parent acting protectively. This is one of those ones that's a double-edged sword. If people don't act protectively, the department may well take their children. In terms of police, obviously they're able to issue DV applications in their own right. They can charge people with DV offences. It's important to remember that just because a husband assaults a wife, that's not just a civil DV issue. That is actually a criminal assault. It's not okay. And certainly we've been involved in some matters recently where the husband is presently serving jail for a variety of inappropriate behaviours towards their partner. Magistrates Court of Queensland or the local court, depending on which state you're in, have the power to make domestic violence orders or apprehended violence orders, depending on which state you're in. They also have the power to punish perpetrators for breaching those orders. The Family Court and Federal Circuit Court of Australia are apparently about to merge again, which should be delightful and cause all sorts of chaos and mayhem. But they are largely charged with dealing with parenting matters and property matters and spousal maintenance. They have a limited ability to make injunctions, and they have a limited ability to amend domestic violence orders that are made in some circumstances. Hospitals, GPs and health services obviously do medical and counselling stuff. DV Connect and RSPCA both do crisis counselling, safety planning. The RSPCA will also help in some very limited cases with animal placement in circumstances where that's holding someone back. Big picture responses. If someone's coming to you and they're saying, I think we've got a situation, this is what's been happening for me, the responses I'd like to see happening more often. Firstly, violence is never acceptable. It's criminal behaviour. It has no place in our homes and our churches. Secondly, please remember that it's probably much, much worse than is being reported to you. If they're brave enough to talk to you at all, you should take that and run with that. I'll never forget walking into a mediation with a client, and I knew that she'd been the victim of domestic violence. She told me that he'd been a problem. But I walked into this mediation and he was a charming bloke. He shook my hand, introduced himself, was all welcoming and chatty. And the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. And I looked at the mediator and I said, oh, look, I've just forgotten something, hang on a sec. And I went outside, I took my client out. And I said to her, what haven't you told me? And it turns out that his domestic violence was far more extensive than what she'd reported, and at times included chasing her around the house with a machete and swinging it at her head. She had some injuries, but they'd been relatively minor. But certainly the machete had on occasions dug into and stuck into the wall. You need to assume that most of what your client is telling, or your parishioner is talking to you about has happened, but probably it's just the tip of the iceberg. I have a very good relationship with a client of mine, and we'd gone through a whole lot of domestic violence stuff, but it wasn't until some weeks later that she informed me that, quite apart from all of the other stuff we'd covered, he'd also raped her. So you assume that it's much worse than is being reported. And what I generally find is if people are very, very distressed and that is at odds with the low level that they're reporting, probably it's high-level domestic violence that they haven't talked to you about.
I was just going to add to that too, that in my experience is true across the spectrum. So it's usually much worse than is being reported to you, even if it is at the low end of the spectrum. Swinging a machete around is pretty much at the extreme end of the spectrum of violence that can occur, and possibly that is not a typical scenario that you might come across day to day. But if a woman is disclosing that something is going on, then probably it is much worse than is being reported to you, even if it's not as bad as a machete situation. I'm was at a presentation just recently and was encouraged to remember that most women in domestic violence circumstances will find it very difficult to reach out and find it very difficult to reach out to their pastor, and typically will only do so once. So there may only be one opportunity that you will get if she is met with that one disclosure with minimising language or indifference or disbelief. She's unlikely to disclose again. So there isn't a serious responsibility, I feel, when you are the recipient of such a disclosure to believe them. Sometimes we hear comments like, oh, she's just making it up, oh, it's just not that bad, or she's just saying that to get at him because, you know, she's upset about something that he's done. And there's been some research around this, and I'm told that false allegations of violence probably constitute about 2% of the allegations that are made. So in 98% of cases, what is being told to you will be true, and it's probably much worse than what they're saying.
Just also remember that in terms of statistical underreporting, only about half of domestic violence victims actually tell anyone that they're the victim of domestic violence. So for everyone who tells you, yes, I'm the victim of domestic violence, chances are there's at least another person who's not going to say anything at all. If you become aware of it, please refer. Please refer. Their life might depend on it. And I say that, and someone once told me that I was being dramatic, but I'm really not. There are times when it's okay to go, I'll need to think about that, and there are times when it's necessary to act and act quickly. So some recommended responses. First question, are you safe? Do you need a safe place to stay right now? Do you want me to come and collect you / the children / the dog? Do you have a plan to keep safe? What are you going to do if he turns up, if this happens, if that happens? How can I help? Please listen to them and don't judge them. It's important that they know this is not their fault. This behaviour is not okay. It's behaviour by someone else. And often people feel like it is their fault. They've been told things like, if you didn't make me mad, then it wouldn't happen. And the truth is, that's a lie. People say, for example, if you didn't antagonise him, then he wouldn't lose control. Well, the truth of the matter is that the research shows very clearly that most men who perpetrate violence against women in their home live very controlled lives outside of their home. They don't lose their cool at work. They don't lose their cool down at the pub. And what that tells us is that actually they can control it. They just choose not to. It's important to be referring to another appropriate service. It's important to be careful, very cautious about advising victims of domestic violence about withdrawing applications or returning home. I'll be really blunt with you. You want to talk to someone about withdrawing a domestic violence application or returning to a domestic violence situation, you could be sending someone home to die. That's the stakes we're dealing. This quote is a quote that Eustacia brought up for me, and I really, really love it. So I really want to hand over to her to talk to you about that.
I think particularly in family situations, what we often hear is, I don't want to take sides, or, oh, we love both of you and we want to be careful to, in fact, love both of you through this situation. But I think it's really important to remember that we are not dealing with a disagreement over what should be had for dinner or where we should go for a holiday. This is not the time or the place for conflict resolution in a more traditional sense. So I thought this quote really summarised it beautifully. It is not possible to be truly balanced in one's views of an abuser and an abused woman. As Dr. Judith Hammond explains eloquently in her masterwork, Trauma and Recovery, Neutrality actually serves the interests of the perpetrator much more than those of the victim, and so it's not neutral. Although an abuser prefers to have you wholeheartedly on his side, he will settle contentedly for your decision to take a middle stance, a neutral stance if you like. Because to him, that means you don't see the couple's you see the couple's problems as partly her fault and partly his fault, which means it isn't abuse. And I think that particularly as pastors and even as Christians in the church, there is that sense in which, oh, I just want to be Switzerland, I don't want to take sides, I want to be neutral here. But it's actually a very, very difficult position to put an abused woman in, because it also says to her that it's partly her fault. And I just would really encourage pastors, I guess, to really think that one through, because to be neutral is to allow, you know, in this sense, neutral, is to actually allow the abuse to continue. It means that she doesn't have a safe place to go, a safe place to talk to, and won't get the support she needs to either deal with the situation or remove herself from the situation. I've just also put in a link there to saferresources.org.au, which is a resource produced by an organisation called Common Grace. It's a non-denominational group, and essentially this resource is designed for churches and for people who work in churches, whether they're pastors or not, to think through some of the theological issues around domestic violence and how to formulate a very practical response that's easy to implement there. I have found it to be a very useful source of information, a very practical guide, a simple guide to think through some of the more complex issues, because we can't just say, well, yes, he's remorseful, therefore we forgive and move on. I mean, there needs to be a little bit more depth to it than that, and that's a really good starting place, I think, if you want to think through these issues a bit more fully.
The other thing I'd say is I've had a number of DV victims come to me over the years, and they find themselves in a position where they're effectively asked to leave the church because, you know, the husband's high up, he's an elder, he's intricately involved in all sorts of things. And the dispute and the conflict is uncomfortable and it's difficult to manage, and on that basis, perhaps she should leave with the children. I'd ask that if that situation ever arises in your churches, that you think through that, because the practical effect is that you are, in asking someone to leave a church and find another church for them, you are yet again assisting the perpetrator to isolate the woman from her potential support network within the church. And it's particularly devastating for victims of DV when they not only lose everything else, but they lose their church family. So be cautious about it. It does happen from time to time. I haven't seen it for a little while, and I hope I never see it again, but be cautious and be aware. Our contact details. Eustacia, as I said, is heading up the family law team and doing an amazing job. And if you have any people at all that you need to refer, I'm sure that she would be absolutely a brilliant resource. Now, in terms of questions, I know that there were some people who were starting to write things down, and I don't know whether or not there were questions actually finished, but we're going to just leave it open for a couple of minutes in case people have got some questions that they want to ask us. Okay, here we go. We've got questions coming through. So, first question. Are you legally required to report DV to the police even in the case they don't want us to or are fearful of it escalating? The short version is, Peter, that's a fabulous question, but it's also a question that the answer depends entirely on what state you're in. Now, if you are in the Northern Territory, you are absolutely legally required to report it to the police, even if they don't want you to. I'd have to double check. Some of the other states do have obligations where there are children involved, but at the moment in Queensland, it's not a requirement. However, I would encourage you to have a look at your child protection policy, because I know this was discussed at some point previously. I think the big picture is you need to seriously have a think about what is the risk here and whether or not you can either convince someone to report it themselves, and often, you know, saying to someone, this is really important, this shouldn't be happening, I think it would be useful to report it to the police. Is it something that, you know, we can make an appointment and I can come with you and talk to the police about? Is that something that, you know, you're okay with? In Queensland, you don't have a legal obligation to report at this point unless there's an issue with physical violence against a child, and that in those circumstances I think you do. But in terms of the big picture, I think domestic violence and the way churches deal with it is a emerging issue, and I think you are going to have to deal with it. And the difficulty, I think, in terms of go forward, and it's an issue that a number of organisations face, is that the requirements across jurisdictions change. At the moment, the highest standard is the Northern Territory in terms of the obligations to report. If you think about it, there's some serious question, I think, in my mind, about why a victim of domestic violence or a child who has been exposed to domestic violence should not be protected in any other state apart from Northern Territory in that way. So what's good for Northern Territory should probably be good for everyone else, but at the moment it's not a legal obligation. I do think that there is going to be a push in terms of what the institutional responses to domestic violence are, but I think it's probably going to be much wider than institutions, and I suspect it's going to be a community-wide issue. I do think it's probably going to be something you're going to have to come to grips with at some point in the future. Yes, I know that there's been a whole lot of privacy issues involved. When people come to talk to you, obviously they expect that some of the things that they talk to you about are going to be kept private. Again, this is one of those spaces where I think there is some benefit in saying, hey, it sounds like this might be domestic violence. I think it's probably something you should talk to police about. We can talk about safety arrangements. I'm happy to support you to go and do that. I think it's actually useful to support them through that process if they want to do that. In terms of privacy stuff, I think you need to consider that on a case-by-case basis, because the truth is I have obligations in terms of privacy and non-disclosure as a lawyer, but there are certainly exceptions to that. So, for example, it's very clear in the Australian Solicitor Conduct Rules that where someone is in imminent danger, I am able to disclose. And I have gone to police on occasions and said, my client is in imminent danger, she's telephoned me, she's barricaded in a bathroom, he's screaming down the other end of the phone, this is the location, please go and help. So I think it's important to think through outside of the pressure cooker when you may or may not be able to disclose, because those things will come up at some point.
If you're able to have a discussion with someone too, that can form part of their safety planning. They may not be ready for any disclosure at that point, but you might discuss between you and agree that there's some sort of trigger that occurs, at which point you're free to make the disclosure. I think that discussion around safety planning is really important.
And So safety planning, there's no magic in it. It's, are you safe? What are the potential areas that you might not be safe? Can you pack a bag for you and the kids and make sure you've got your scripts, make sure you've got copies of important documents, and at some point in time you're going to, we're going to do this over the next week, and then you're going to leave, and once you leave then it's going to be reported, for example. Because if you report, it's part of the safety discussion, because sometimes if you report, that might increase the safety issues that the person experiences in the short term. So it is important to make sure that that's a conversation that you have. Okay, so the next question is, if they both come to the church, is it okay to confront the person who's committing the violence?
I think the framework is always going to have to be
safety first
of the person who's experiencing that violence.
So the starting point is absolutely make sure that the person who's experiencing violence is safe, make sure that they are well supported and they have what they need first. I think it's okay, with their permission, to sit down with the person who's committing the violence and say, you know what, this is what we've been told, and this behaviour is not acceptable. It's not biblical, it's not legal, and it's not okay. But in doing so, you need to make sure that the safety issues are dealt with first. And you need to remember when you're having that conversation that is a dangerous conversation to be having for yourself. Because when people do not feel they have any options and there is no way out, they come out swinging. And I will tell you that over the years there's been more than one time that I've had credible and serious death threats made against myself. When we work with both victims and perpetrators, we're very careful about a bunch of things that possibly is fairly unique to what we do. So, for example, when I meet with someone who is alleged to be a perpetrator of domestic violence, I arrange the room very carefully so that I'm the closest to the door. Or if I've got a junior lawyer with me, they're closest to the door and I'm next. I make sure that I'm meeting them in rooms where there is nothing that they can throw at me or use as a weapon, for example. People think that I'm crazy because I sometimes take the garbage bins and things like that out of the room so that they can't be used as a weapon. So, yes, I don't think it's a problem to confront a person, but you do need to be careful about it and you need to make sure safety is dealt with first. Ooh. Okay, so the next question is, should churches have more courses about how to avoid DV in Christian communities?
I'll talk about that.
Yeah, go for it.
I have a view about that. Look, we can't all be specialists in everything. And we can't all be doctors and we can't all be social workers, and nor should we be. But in much the same way that it's helpful for people to know first aid, I think there is a broad value in assisting people to, not freak out when someone makes a disclosure to them, because it is such a common experience. I think that it is helpful for churches to be very clear on what they believe and how they handle it, and how they would expect parishioners to handle it. I don't think you can expect your average person in the pew, or even perhaps your average pastor, to be a skilled domestic violence worker, but you can equip them with some basic tools, some basic questions to ask, and some places that they can be referred to. Not everyone will want to disclose to pastors, to make disclosures to their pastors, so it is, I think, very helpful, because it is such a common issue, to be able to say to people, look, this is our position on it, and this is how, the places you can refer people to. I think in not a dissimilar way to the Are You OK campaign, which is much like psychological first aid. It's almost like first aid. I get a lot of inquiries, oh, someone said this to me, I just didn't even know what to say. And I think if we can help people just take those first few steps of, are you safe? This is who I can help you talk to. That will do a lot of good, you know, and I don't think it needs to be as far as everybody's got to become a domestic violence specialist.
I think there's a lot to be said for discussions within a church context of what respectful and appropriate relationships look like.
That's what it comes down to.
Yeah, and that's not just between spouses, but, you know, between parents and kids, between husbands and wives, between people within the church community. You know, a respectful relationship is one that is free from elements of control. And the unfortunate reality is that there have been at least some fairly spectacular examples in Queensland media in particular that come to mind over the last couple of years of instances where the Bible has been used to say you have to live with it and you have to put up with it and you have to do everything that your husband says because that's what the Bible says. And the difficulty is that is at odds with a variety of parts of the Bible, but also respectful relationships more generally. So I think it's important to talk about it in the context of relationship. Okay, so we've got another question about male victims of female domestic violence. In terms of, let me just read. Okay, so in terms of men who are victims of domestic violence, there's a couple of issues. I've represented a number of men who, over the course of the years, who have in fact been the victims of domestic violence. Overwhelmingly, domestic violence is an issue about male violence against women. It's a tiny percentage of domestic violence that involves women who are perpetrators against men. One of the difficulties is that there are sometimes occasions, and it depends on the typology of domestic violence that you're dealing with, and we haven't talked about that because it's kind of complex, but there are some typologies of domestic violence that do involve women effectively fighting back and defending themselves to some degree, and sometimes that's misinterpreted as they're the primary perpetrator, so that's difficult because sometimes actually it's more complex than they've hit their partner or they've been violent towards their partner. It's actually a symptom of they've been the victim of domestic violence for so long that at some point they just don't cope with it. So I think it's too simplistic to talk about DV Connect, for example, not being terribly helpful in convincing female perpetrators that perhaps, you know, they don't need the help to change, that perhaps they're the victim of domestic violence as well. There's a whole lot of complexity involved in whether it's coercive controlling, situational couple violence, mutual violent restraint, etc. So be cautious about those sorts of judgment calls. The other thing to say is that, and I'm not aware, I don't recall the exact figures, but overwhelmingly where women have been perpetrators of domestic violence against men, a very high percentage of them involve significant mental health problems, often, you know, psychoses, bipolar, significant issues with being drug affected. So again, it's not the same typology, generally speaking, as violence by men against women. There's violence by men against women that we deal with most often is what we would call coercive and controlling domestic violence, which was also the most deadly and the most significant, really.
I think it's worth pointing out too that the law is the same.
Yeah.
For men and for women, the standard of proof is the same.
Yep.
The burden of responsibility for proving that the violence has occurred is the same. And in my experience, you have to meet those standards of proof no matter what the gender of your client is, and that needs to be met.
That's right. The other thing to say is, and it perhaps doesn't come up as much in churches necessarily, but we're seeing an increasing tendency for men, particularly in same-sex couples, to be the victim of domestic violence as well. And that tends to be more coercive, controlling. Okay. Last chance for questions, otherwise we're going to close the webinar off today. While you're thinking about that, I'd just like to say thank you for coming, and for those who have lasted the distance with questions, thank you very much. I am absolutely delighted to have co-presented with you, Stacia, and we will hopefully see you around.